Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the delay. Had a little bit of some technical issues this morning. I'm not sure if it was me. Probably it was. So my name's Jessica Davis. I am with the Institute of Clinical Excellence. I teach the Performing Arts Division for ICE, and I also work in the spine courses. So today, happy Tuesday, by the way, and happy almost Thanksgiving. Today we're going to talk about Achilles tendinopathy in dancers. So I had a request from Virtual ICE, and I realized I haven't covered this topic in great detail, so I thought it would be a really good topic for the day for those of you who are encountering dancers with this. It's very prevalent. As we've talked about in previous episodes, the lower extremity injuries for dancers, especially overuse injuries, is unfortunately very common, and that has a lot of issues that we've talked about before to consider there. But when it comes to Achilles tendinopathy, for dancers specifically, we need to consider a few different variables. First of all, you have to consider that the dancer has to have adequate strength, obviously. So they have to maintain prolonged periods on point and in releve and various, plantar flex type positions. They have to have the strength to manage the loads that they will have with jumping. And they also have to have the adequate range of motion. So they need enough dorsiflexion so that when they land from a jump, they have adequate power to come up from that jump. And a lot of dancers unfortunately lack the flexibility in the gastric soleus because they do spend a lot of time in that plantar flex type positioning. And they also have to have that optimal stiffness to transfer that energy for the takeoff and leaps. So all of those variables are important to consider. And when you're doing your evaluation, as I've talked about earlier, you have to do a really good subjective exam. You need to know exactly what's going on with your dancer, when they're experiencing the pain, what choreography they're doing, and what type of shoes they may be wearing. So shoe wear is a huge deal. As we know, different shoes, unfortunately in the dance world, do not support adequately. And so because of this, a lot of dancers can experience injuries because of that. And so if there's anything that you can do to somewhat alleviate that, if you can, you also have to know the floor that they're dancing on. So they may be dancing on concrete, they may be on a wood floor, they may be on a raked stage. So there can be different variables that can be impacting that dancer. How are they starting a new performance season? Is it new choreography? So all of those variables are important to consider in the subjective exam. Know when they have the pain, what's creating it, where their limitations are. Then you have to consider different variables just in an orthopedic realm. So looking at, are there different impairments when we're doing our objective exam? So looking at the foot and ankle, is there any hypomobility? Is there hypermobility? And of course, strength issues. So looking up that kinetic chain. So I found a really neat article that I wanted to bring up. It was published in 2011 in JOSPT, and they looked at the soda shaw. So the soda shaw is it's a leap that a dancer does. So they come out, and I would try to demonstrate it, but I don't think you guys would be able to see unless I had somebody videoing me. But it's a leap. They come from 2 feet. They do a little maneuver and they land up in the air, and then they land on 2 feet. So they looked at, and they compared 2 groups of individuals. So they had the control group, which was 8 dancers without a history at all of any Achilles tendinopathy. And then they compared it to 8 other dancers who did have a history in the past 6 months to 5 years of having Achilles tendinopathy. So it wasn't acute, meaning that they were able to do the soda shaw, so there weren't limitations in their ability to perform the maneuver. But what they wanted to look at was, well, are there any variabilities up the kinetic chain that may be potentially precursors or something to explore? And what was nice was between the 2 groups, there wasn't a difference in statistically significant difference in body weight or height or any other variabilities that contribute to a change. So what they found was they looked at 2 variables. They looked at takeoff and landing. And what they found was at the peak of the braking phase, and they defined the braking phase as when the dancer was getting ready to prepare for the jump. So they were getting ready, they were in the plie position, and they're getting ready to explode. What they found was the dancers who had a history of Achilles tendinopathy actually had a peak hip adduction during that phase. So their hips were adducting at a greater rate comparable to those who didn't have a history of Achilles tendinopathy. And then during the push-off, so when they were actually exploding and pushing off, they found that there was a greater amount of knee internal rotation in those dancers compared to those who did not have a history of any Achilles tendinopathy. So what was also really neat about this study was that between the groups, they found no observable differences at the foot and ankle. So I really like that because it goes into what is coming up with the evidence that it's up the kinetic chain or it's down, but it's not just at the foot and ankle. You've got to consider all the potential variables that may be contributing. So for some reason, the dancers that had the Achilles tendinopathy in their history, there's something going on at the hip. They had that adduction and that knee internal rotation. So when you explore it further, dancers who developed this, the number one cause that they found was forced turnout. So we've talked at length about what turnout is. So turnout is that perfect 180 that dancers seek, and a lot of dancers don't have the anatomy and they force it somewhere. So they typically will force it through the lower kinetic chain or into the lumbar spine with excessive lordosis. So if they're forced turnout, so when you're doing your exam, you need to see, is this dancer using forced turnout? They also, another precursor that they found is that dancers who develop this, for whatever reason, aren't landing adequately through their heels. So dancers, when they get fatigued, will often not allow their heels to come to a perfect end. So they'll jump and they'll keep their heels up a little bit. This will happen when they're fatigued, or also if the choreography is too fast. So if they have to keep up with a particular pace and they're trying to go with the music, often to keep up with the choreography, they may not get those heels down. So when you're doing your exam, you need to look at these dancers in a fatigued state. So depending on the acuity, obviously, so that's where it comes with the irritability, right? So if this is a highly irritable dancer, we're not going to be taking them to their fatigue level and forcing the pain. But if this is a relatively low irritability patient, we want to test it to the max so that we can see what's going on. You need to look at your dancers in slow-mo video because, again, there's things that we're not going to pick up with the eye and don't just look at the ankle and foot. You need to look at what's happening up the kinetic chain and see if there's something. You need to strength test them. Dancers lack proper, believe it or not, proximal hip recruitment. So it's more of a motor recruitment issue. So look at what's happening there when you're strength testing and seeing if they're properly using those muscles. So when it comes down to treatments, and we've talked a lot about an eval, and I go over that a lot when I do these, but when it comes to treatment, again, think of it from an orthopedic standpoint first. So if you're finding any kind of impairments, fix them. If you think those impairments are leading to it, the only way you're going to know is using that test-retest model, right? So if you find an impairment, correct it, and then retest and see if you've generated a change. That's how you know you're moving in the right direction, right? Consider the stage of the injury. So if it's acute, obviously we have to work on pain control. But remember, dancers need to keep dancing if possible because their biggest fear when they see a healthcare professional is that we're going to tell them they can't dance. So get creative. Maybe you do floor bar work. Maybe you modify and they don't do different jumping. Whatever is aggravating, but try to get creative and continue them strengthening and working with what they're able to do. When you get into that subacute, obviously we know that eccentrics are important, so working on that eccentric loading to the tendon. And then, again, you've got to work up the kinetic chain. So when it comes to treatment, you've got to get creative. So you've got to consider what these dancers have to do. Remember, they go through full range of motion, so you need to strengthen that full range of motion. They need to have proper landing, so you need to have them jumping and working on their landing mechanics. If they can't handle it in a vertical plane, why don't you use a reformer like I have over there? Use a reformer or use a shuttle and get them jumping so that you can work on the proper loading and explosion that they need to do and address any kind of kinetic chain issues. But I wanted to show you some exercises, so because I always like to. So bear with me, I'm going to switch the camera over here. And I'm going to show you my foot, so please ignore that too because as I was a former dancer, so my feet aren't the best. So it's rare I'm going to show my foot here, but I'm going to just so that you guys can learn. Okay, so I'm flipping the camera so you guys can see here. Let's see if I can flip this. Okay. All right, so here's my foot. So what you need to do with a dancer's foot, and you can see I wasn't trained properly, and this is because we just didn't know back then, but my feet curl because I didn't gain good foot intrinsics. So when I would do a short foot exercise, my tendency is to want to curl my toes like this. When you teach your dancer the short foot, what you want them to learn is to truly expand through their toe. So you give them the cues, you can give them the cue at their big toe and their little toe and say, push these out and try to flatten through their toes. So it's important that they learn to expand here, but in the same regard, they've got to start getting that short foot or developing that arch. So working on those foot intrinsics, so not just the simple towel curls where they're curling their toes, you need to teach them that, but keeping those toes out and then creating that arch. So at times, it's easier to do in a seated position, so you probably can't see, or you kind of can see me in the mirror. I'm in a seated position here because it's easier for me to do in a non-weight bearing, and then I can practice that and progress into a weight bearing. Watching that they don't engage their tibialis anterior. So you want to try to shut that down and have them learn how to engage truly their foot intrinsics without compensatory means, okay? So then let's get a little bit more challenging here. So what we want to do is work in a weight bearing position now. So the dancer's gotten that. So we want to work up the kinetic chain. So one of my favorite exercises, and hopefully you guys can see me here, is to do, these are called an outward or an inward pivot. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna have your dancer learn that proper foot position, so they're expanding through their toes, right? They're creating that arch, and then they're in a weight bearing position. And what they're gonna do, they're gonna hold on to a TheraBand. Let me get a little closer here. And then what they'll do, keeping that position, they're gonna rotate in and out with their body, holding on to that TheraBand, in and out. So this is a great up the kinetic chain exercise, and if you think about what dancers need to do, they need to be able to rotate and to move. So if you can teach them the proper foot position, so they're gaining that in a standing position, that's a nice exercise early on. Again, even if they're acute, they can tolerate that, because what aggravates them, it's going to be the demi-plie position, it's getting into that full dorsiflex position, or it's going to be exploding. So working on even just prancing exercises where you're just kind of teaching them to properly explode and fully articulate through the foot, not curling their toes, is helpful. But another one, and this was one that we were exploring when we were in Portland when I was teaching my course, and it was, by the way, that was an amazing course. Thank you all for attending. We had such a blast. What you can do in standing, so dancers, what you want to train is that first ray depression. So you take a TheraBand, right? And let's see if you guys can see. So you're going to take a TheraBand and you're going to fold it into 4, like a teeny tiny little thing. You're going to put it under their big toe, okay? See that? Right under their big toe. And not too far under their foot, because if it's too far or too flat, they're not gonna have to work really hard. You wanna fold it and keep it right under their big toe. Then, if you guys here, I'm gonna get closer so you guys can see me here. So I'm gonna put this underneath, fold it, and this is really hard holding a camera. Okay, so folding it there. Then, what I'm gonna have the dancer do is they're gonna wrap it around their foot this way. Why? Because what happened at the knee, they internally rotated. So I want to work on challenging that. I want them to get that first ray depression, spread their toes, keep that big toe down on the TheraBand. I'm going to have this band wrapped around. Then I'm going to wrap it around my opposite leg, because I'm going to challenge up the kinetic chain. And then what you want is you want to have a loop on the end of your band. And I'm going to put this down for a second because I'm going to put it around my wrist. So you put this around their wrist. Why? Because I don't want them to use their hand to grip. Dancers, we don't want to train that. We want them to use scapular stability, so they're going to use their arms. So you're going to see what I'm going to do. So I'm standing now. Hopefully you guys can see here. So I've got the first ray depression. I've got this wrapped around my opposing leg. I'm keeping my toes spread. I'm keeping my arch. I'm then using my opposite arm out this way, getting some scapular stability. And then I'm going to work on maintaining that position of my leg as I go into a slightly abducted position. Now watch, I'm doing this turned in. Why? Because dancers work too much and turned out. So when you were cross-training them, they really have a hard time working and turned in, but they need to learn that so they can work opposing muscles, okay? So remember, this is an overuse injury, so we're addressing different impairments. So they're gonna be here and they have to steady themselves and work on this position. So I'm gonna back up so you guys can see the full picture, hopefully. Okay, so we're here, and then maintaining that position, holding that scapular stability, and working on holding this. So you guys should try this, play around with it. You'll see how it works the supporting leg. It also works the opposing leg, but it's also working their arm. So it's kind of, again, up the entire kinetic chain. But don't forget about jumping. So where would I take this? I'm gonna then work on having my dancers do box jumps and working on the proper landing, making sure that they're fully articulating. So I'm gonna flip this around. So hopefully you guys found that helpful. Again, look into the toe shoes. You've got to consider if they are on point, what's happening with that toe shoe. That's a whole different topic, but make sure they're fully articulating up onto the full box of the toe shoe, that the shank of the toe shoe is appropriate for your dancer, that they're not having to work their foot too hard. But again, remember, even thinking about that study that I showed you, they didn't find any discrepancies. Now, again, this is more of a chronic nature, but at the ankle and foot, it was up the kinetic chain. So consider that. Consider what you've got up higher. Work on your PNF of the pelvis. Challenge your dancer in that way. Get them properly firing and get creative with exercise, because dancers are creative by nature. They're gonna like it if you're creative. So hopefully that was helpful. Feel free to reach out to me. And again, I apologize about the time delay. Have a wonderful Tuesday and happy Thanksgiving, everybody. All right, bye.